After breakfast, he was in his room, putting the finishing touches to his golfing costume. Fortune had again allotted the Colonel to him for a partner, when one of the maids came in. "Oh, if you please, sir, would you like any extra blankets on your bed, sir?" "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn rather colder this evening." In a very short time, the maid was back with the blanket.
"Which bed should I put it on, sir?" she asked. "It's just that you seem to have tried both of them. Leastways, we had to make 'em both up this morning."
"Really? How very absurd," said Parkins.
"I certainly never touched the other, except to lay some things on it. Did it actually seem to have been slept in?" "Oh, yes, sir," said the maid. "Why, all the things was crumpled and thrown about all ways, if you'll excuse me, sir, quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very poor night, sir."
"Dear me," said Parkins.
"Well, I may have disordered it more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to have given you the extra trouble, I'm sure. I expect a friend of mine soon, by the way, a gentleman from Cambridge, to come and occupy it for a night or two. That'll be all right, I suppose, won't it?" "Oh, yes, to be sure, sir." "Thank you, sir, it's no trouble, I'm sure," said the maid, and departed to giggle with her colleagues. Parkins set forth with a stern determination to improve his game, and he succeeded so far in this enterprise that the Colonel, who had been rather repining at the prospect of a second day's play in his company, became quite chatty as the morning advanced, and his voice boomed out over the flats as certain also of our minor poets have said, like some great bourdon in a minster tower. "Extraordinary wind we had last night," he said. "In my old home we should have said someone had been whistling for it." "Should you indeed?" said Parkins. "Is there a superstition of that kind still current in your part of the country?" "Well, I don't know about superstition," said the Colonel. "They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. And my experience is, mind you, that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to, and have held to for generations. But anyway, old boy, it's your drive." When conversation was resumed, Parkins said with a slight hesitancy, "About what you were saying just now, Colonel, I think I ought to tell you that my own views on such subjects are very strong. I am in fact a convinced disbeliever in what is called the supernatural." "What?" said the Colonel. "You mean to tell me you don't believe in second sight, or ghosts, or anything of that kind?" "In nothing whatsoever of that kind," returned Parkins firmly. "Well," said the Colonel, "but it appears to me at this rate, sir, that you must be a little better than the Sadducee." Parkins was on the point of answering that, in his opinion, the Sadducees were the most sensible persons he had ever read of in the Old Testament, but, feeling some doubt as to whether much mention of them was to be found in the work, he preferred to laugh the accusation off. "Now, as to whistling for the wind, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern winds are really not all perfectly known. To fisher-folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger, is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards, a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly or possessed a barometer could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers, and only a few rules for prophesying weather. What more natural than the eccentric personage I postulated should be regarded as having raised the wind, or that he or she should clutch eagerly at the reputation of being able to do so? Now take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call. If anybody had seen me—" The Colonel had been a little restive under this harangue, and Parkins had, I fear, fallen somewhat into the tone of a lecturer. But at the last sentence the Colonel stopped. "Whistling, were you?" he said. "And what sort of whistle did you use? Play this stroke first." "Well, Colonel, it's a rather curious one. I have it in my— No, I say I left it in my room. As a matter of fact, I found it yesterday." And then Parkins narrated the manner of his discovery of the whistle. Upon hearing which the Colonel grunted, and opined that, in Parkins' place, he should himself be careful about using a thing that had belonged to a set of papists, of whom, speaking generally, it might be affirmed that you never knew what they might not have been up to. From this topic, he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who had given notice on the previous Sunday that Friday would be the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, and that there would be service at 11 o'clock in the church. This and other similar proceedings constituted, in the Colonel's view, a strong presumption that the vicar was a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit, and Parkins, who could not very readily follow the Colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was no talk on either side of their separating after lunch. Both continued to play well during the afternoon, or at least well enough to make them forget everything else until the light began to fail them. Not until then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory. But it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. He may as well go home with the Colonel. As they turned a corner of the house, the Colonel was almost knocked down by a boy who rushed into him at the very top of his speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. The first words of the warrior were naturally those of reproof and objurgation, but he very quickly discerned that the boy was almost speechless with fright. Inquiries are useless at first. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl, and still clung to the Colonel's legs. He was at last detached, but continued to howl.
"What in the world is the matter with you?" said the Colonel. "What have you seen?"
"I've seen it wave me out the window,"
wailed the boy.
"I don't like it."
"What window?" said the irritated Colonel. "Come on, pull yourself together, my boy,"
"The front window was at your hotel,"
said the boy. At this point, Parkins was in favour of sending the boy home, but the Colonel refused. He wanted to get to the bottom of it. He said it was most dangerous to give a boy such a fright as this one had, and if it turned out that people had been playing jokes, they should suffer for it in some way. And by a series of questions, he made out the story. The boy had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe with some others. Then they had gone home to their dinners, and he was just going, when he happened to look up at the front window and see it waving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it wasn't a right thing, not to say not a right person. Was there a light in the room? No, he didn't think to look if there was a light. Which was the window? Was it the top one or the second one?
"The second one it was. The big window that got the two little ones at the sides."
"Very well, my boy," said the Colonel, after a few more questions. "You run away home now. I expect it was just some person trying to give you a start. And here's a sixpence. No, I see it's a shilling. And you be off home, and don't think any more about it."
The youth hurried off with agitated thanks, and the Colonel and Parkins went round to the front of the globe and reconnoitred. There was only one window answering to the description that they had been hearing. "Well, that's curious," said Parkins. "It's evidently my window that the lad was talking about. Will you come up for a moment, Colonel Wilson? We ought to be able to see if anyone has been taking liberties in my room." They were soon in the passage, and Parkins made as if to open the door. Then he stopped and checked his pockets. "This may be more serious than I thought, Colonel," was his next remark. "I remember now that before I started this morning, I locked the door. It's locked now, and what's more, here is the key." And he held up the key. "Now," he went on, "if the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that, well, that I don't approve of it at all." Conscious of a somewhat weak climax, he busied himself in opening the door, which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems disturbed."
"Except your bed," put in the Colonel.
"Oh, but that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one."
"But it does look as if someone has been playing tricks with it."
It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most torturous confusion. Parkins pondered. "That must be it," he said at last. "I disordered the clothes last night in unpacking, and they haven't made it since. Perhaps they came in to make it, and then the boy saw them through the window, and they were called away and locked the door after them. Yes, I think that must be it."
"Well, ring and ask,"
said the Colonel, and this appealed to Parkins as practical. The maid appeared, and to make a long story short, disposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been there since. This was a puzzle. Investigation showed that nothing of value had been taken, and Parkins remembered the disposition of the small objects on tables and so forth well enough to be pretty sure that no pranks had been played with them. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson furthermore agreed that neither of them had given the duplicate key of the room to any person whatever during the day. Nor could Parkins, fair-minded man as he was, detect anything in the demeanour of master, mistress, or maid that indicated guilt. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the Colonel. The latter was unwontedly silent and pensive at dinner and throughout the evening. When he bade good night to Parkins, he murmured in a gruff undertone,
"You know where I am if you want me during the night."
"Why, yes, thank you, Colonel Wilson. I think I do. But there isn't much prospect of my disturbing you, I hope." He turned away, leaving Parkins in act to speak at the bottom of the stair, and soon each was in his own bedroom. When Parkins had read a somewhat solid work long enough to produce a decided wish for sleep, he cast a drowsy glance round the room, blew out the candle, and fell back upon the pillow. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and investigate? Or could he manage to sleep if he did not? For some minutes he lay and pondered over the possibilities. Then he turned over sharply, and with all his eyes open, lay breathlessly listening. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, for there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again. There was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. Surely the reader could hardly imagine how dreadful it was for him to see a figure suddenly sit up, in what he had known was an empty bed. He was out of his own bed in one bound and made a dash towards the window. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden smooth motion, slipped from the bed and took up a position with outspread arms between the two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched in a horrid perplexity. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a truly horrible face of crumbled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. But he was not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness it moved into the middle of the room, and as it groped and waved, one corner of its drapery swept across Parkins' face. He could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him upon the instant, and the next moment he was halfway through the window backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close into his own. At this last possible second, deliverance came, as the Colonel burst the door open, and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the floor lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. There is not much question as to what would have happened to Parkins if the Colonel had not intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window, or else lost his wits.
But it is not so evident what more the creature that came in answer to the whistle could have done than frighten. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it, save the bedclothes of which it made itself a body. The Colonel was of the opinion that if Parkins had closed with it, it could really have done very little, and its only one power was that of frightening. The whole incident, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There is really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the Professor's view on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field late on a winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night.